I remember walking into that party as if it were the culmination of months of quiet patience and carefully suppressed doubts, dressed in a way that made me feel like I was finally shining, convinced that the evening would confirm what I had tried so hard to believe about him, about us, about the future I thought we were building together. The air was heavy with perfume, laughter, and that blend of music and chatter that gives parties their strange mix of chaos and elegance. And as I crossed the threshold into the house, I thought I was stepping into a celebration of us. He had told me it was his night, his way of thanking everyone who had supported him through a recent career milestone. But in my mind, it was also about me, about us, about being by his side as his partner, the one he had leaned on in the quiet hours when no one else was around, the one who had celebrated victories in private and soothed failures when the world wasn't looking. I had expected smiles, shared glances across the room, perhaps even a whispered comment about how good I looked, or how proud he was that I was there with him. What I didn't expect was that cold feeling, the sudden weight of every instinct I had ignored crashing back onto me the moment I saw how he moved through the crowd, how his eyes were searching not for me but for someone else. There is something unsettling about realizing that a night you thought would define you in one way is about to define you in an entirely different one. I felt it in the way people greeted me, polite but detached, as if I were not the center of his world, but rather a supporting character who had wandered onto the wrong stage. The champagne glasses clinking, the bursts of laughter, the faint glances exchanged between strangers who suddenly seemed to know something I didn't. Everything formed a strange backdrop against which my own smile began to feel rehearsed. Still, I told myself I was imagining things, that I was letting insecurity twist a perfectly normal evening into something darker. I had done that before, second-guessed myself, reminded myself to trust him, to trust us, to push away those tiny warning bells that whispered when his phone lit up with a name I didn't recognize, when he came home later than expected with explanations that were too detailed, too polished. Tonight, I insisted to myself, was different. Tonight was his night, and mine by extension, and nothing was going to shake that. But the truth of nights like these is that they hold mirrors you can't avoid, reflections in other people's eyes, echoes in the laughter that exclude you. I found myself standing near the bar, pretending to study the arrangement of bottles, tracing the condensation on my glass, trying to quiet the strange unease rising in me. He was across the room, animated, gesturing, and yet even in the crowd he managed to create a space that excluded me. I could feel it, and though I didn't know yet what words would soon cut through the noise and change everything, I already felt that tightening in my chest, the intuition that perhaps this party wasn't meant for me at all. There's a cruelty in the way truth announces itself, not in silence, not in private whispers, but in rooms full of people where every glance becomes a witness and every sound sharpens the moment. And as I watched him move closer to the center of attention, ready to speak, ready to make the announcement that would turn this evening into the story I now tell, I realized that the party I thought was ours had never belonged to me at all. It was his, yes, but also hers, though I hadn't yet met her eyes, though I hadn't yet heard the words that would slice through me with surgical precision. Even then, before the blow came, something inside me began to retreat, not in weakness, but in a strange form of preservation. It was as if a part of me already knew that this would be the moment I would stop being the quiet supporter, the giver, the one who always endured. Instead, it would be the moment I would begin to gather myself differently, colder, sharper, no longer waiting for gratitude or recognition. That realization lingered at the edges of my mind as I smiled faintly at a stranger's joke, sipped from my glass, and prepared myself for whatever words were about to land, unaware that within minutes I would be forced to confront not only his betrayal, but also the part of me that had long refused to acknowledge it. The night was supposed to be ours, but as the music dipped and his voice rose above the crowd, I understood that it was about to become mine, in a way he could never have imagined. The moment arrived in a way so ordinary it felt almost cruel, with the music softening just enough for his voice to rise above it, confident and assured, the voice I had once trusted, the voice that had whispered promises into my ear in darker rooms when no one else was listening. He stood at the center of the living room, drink in hand, posture straight, and practiced as though he had rehearsed this speech in the mirror. People quieted around him, the kind of hush that precedes some big reveal, some celebratory announcement, and I felt my chest tighten because instinct told me the words that were about to leave his mouth weren't meant to lift me up, but to bury me under their weight. And then he said it, so casually, with a smile stretched across his face, that she was their special guest, a phrase delivered with such charm and ease that at first it felt almost harmless, almost like a joke that had missed its mark. But the way he looked at her when he said it, the way his eyes softened in a way they hadn't for me in months, the way she smiled back with a kind of private victory that no one else seemed to question, told me everything I needed to know. In that second, the room shifted. The lights felt brighter, harsher, as though they had all turned to stage spotlights shining directly on me, demanding a reaction. Laughter erupted, not cruel at first, but complicit, as though everyone had been in on some secret and I was the last one to discover it. I could feel heat rising to my cheeks, though it wasn't embarrassment. It was clarity, sharp and unforgiving, a sudden awareness of how long this had been going on, how many details I had overlooked, how many nights he had spun stories with the same smooth tongue he now used to crown her presence as something exceptional. My drink trembled slightly in my hand, but I kept my body still, my expression frozen in what must have looked like a polite smile, because the one thing I refused to give him in that moment was the spectacle of my pain. If he wanted to make me the fool in front of all these people, if he thought my reaction would be his final flourish, he was mistaken. Her presence burned into me then. She was dressed like she belonged to the occasion, perfectly tailored, perfectly confident, a woman who knew she had already won before I even realized I was competing. I studied her quietly, letting the contours of her smile and the sparkle of her jewelry etch themselves into my memory, because I wanted to know who it was that had occupied the spaces I once thought were mine. She leaned into him with a familiarity that left no doubt, and while others clapped and raised their glasses, I felt the weight of years pressing down on me, all the nights I had given, all the sacrifices I had made, suddenly stacked against this effortless introduction. The phrase replayed in my head, special guest, like a knife twisting, because it wasn't just about her presence that night. It was an admission of her place in his life, a title he had reserved for someone else while keeping me in the shadows of my own devotion. Still, I remained silent, because silence was stronger than any outburst could ever be. I realized, in the stillness of my own restraint, that this was the moment that would define me, not as the betrayed woman crumbling in public, but as the one who would leave differently, the one who would carry herself out of that room, with a grace so sharp, it would slice deeper than any argument. He had wanted applause, admiration, perhaps even envy, but what he didn't expect was the calm I found in that instant, the steel that rose quietly within me as I understood that this was no longer about him. It was about me, about what I would do next, about how I would reclaim what I had given so freely and never let him hold it against me again. Every word he spoke afterward blurred, as if the air had become thick and heavy, muffling the voices around me. I heard fragments of toasts, of praise, of her laughter mingling with his, but all of it faded beneath the singular clarity that now guided me. I no longer belonged to that room, no longer needed to fight for space in it. My decision was already forming, deliberate and cold, and though I stood quietly among the crowd, I knew that in a matter of moments, I would change the course of everything without raising my voice or shedding a tear. He had introduced her as his special guest, and in doing so, he had introduced me to the part of myself that no longer needed him, the part that could already see the way out, the way forward, the way to turn his betrayal into my liberation. That sentence, delivered so carelessly, was the spark that lit a fire he would never be able to extinguish. And as I placed my glass down on a nearby table, smoothing my dress with a calm hand, I knew I would carry those words with me, not as a wound, but as a weapon. They had cut like ice, yes, but ice can be carved into something precise, something sharp, something unstoppable. And that was exactly what I intended to become. The room pulsed with the rhythm of music and chatter, yet inside me there was only stillness, a stillness so profound it almost frightened me. I had just been reduced, in a single sentence, to an afterthought in my own relationship, publicly displaced by a woman who wore her victory on her skin like perfume, and still, I did not collapse. I didn't scream. I didn't break my glass against the floor. I didn't beg for explanations that everyone already knew the answers to. Instead, something strange and undeniable unfurled inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. It was a quiet power, heavy and certain, as though every sacrifice, every late-night compromise, every piece of myself I had surrendered to him had suddenly gathered itself back in one place and taken residence in my chest. And with that power came the smile. Not the smile of a wounded woman covering her pain, not the hollow grin of someone pretending not to care, but a smile born of the knowledge that I had already begun to step out of the trap he thought he'd locked me in. That smile spread slowly, deliberately, as I set my glass down on the nearest table and straightened my shoulders. Around me, laughter rose, glasses clinked, and his voice continued its performance, weaving her into his narrative as if she had always belonged there. But I had already stopped listening. Instead, I studied the people in that room, how they shifted uncomfortably when they looked at me, how they avoided my eyes because they expected pain, humiliation, a reaction that would justify their complicity in my betrayal. They braced themselves for a scene, for a woman undone in front of them all. And when they saw only a serene smile touch my lips, when they saw me nod politely as though I were the hostess of this little charade, I knew I had disarmed them all at once. It unsettled them, the absence of spectacle, the absence of weakness. What they didn't realize was that I was no longer a part of their audience. I had quietly become the playwright, and they were unwittingly acting in a story that would not end the way he imagined. I remember catching his eyes across the crowd just for a moment. He expected anger, maybe tears, maybe even a desperate confrontation that he could dismiss with mockery or charm. But when he saw me smiling, calm, composed, untouchable, something flickered in his expression. Doubt. For a split second, his confidence faltered, and though he tried to mask it with another laugh, another toast, I had seen it. That was the moment I knew I had him, not through words or arguments, but through silence and control. The calm unsettled him more than fury ever could. He had never seen me this way before, and that unfamiliarity was a weapon sharper than anything else I could wield. I reached into my bag and felt the cold metal of my keys, the ones I had given him months ago when I believed we were building a home together, when I thought trust was a gift that bound us. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled them out and held them in my hand, the smile still steady on my face. No one noticed at first. The room was too busy applauding his arrogance. But when I stepped forward and gently brushed past him, I let my hand graze his palm and deposited the keys back into it. For a heartbeat, he looked at me confused, uncertain if it was some gesture of loyalty or defeat, and then he saw my smile again, the kind that revealed nothing and promised everything, and I could see the unease tightening in his jaw. Without a word, I turned on my heel, moving through the crowd as though I were leaving my own party, not his. Every step I took was deliberate, every motion calculated. I wanted him to watch me leave, wanted him to feel the weight of the silence that followed me out. People parted instinctively, eyes following, unsure of what they were witnessing. Some whispered, some pretended not to notice, but they all felt it, that shift in the air when someone chooses dignity over spectacle. That smile carried me through the doorway and out into the night, and I swear the chill air that hit my face was not cold at all, but cleansing, sharp, and invigorating, like the first breath after holding it far too long. For the first time in months, I wasn't suffocating. I wasn't trapped in the web of his lies. I was free, and I was already planning what freedom meant. As I walked away from the house, heels clicking against the pavement, I held on to that smile like it was armor, because it wasn't fragility. It was strategy. He thought he had humiliated me, but humiliation only works if the victim accepts it. I hadn't. I had reclaimed the stage he had stolen, and though I walked out alone, I carried with me far more than he could imagine. The keys were just the first thing I had taken back. Soon he would discover the rest, and that smile he saw on my lips would haunt him, because it would be the last image of me he remembered before his entire world began to unravel. When the door closed behind me and the muffled noise of the party was swallowed by the night, I felt the weight of silence wrap itself around me. For the first time in hours, there were no eyes on me, no false laughter to cut through, no spotlight forcing me to hold my composure. It was just me, and the echo of everything I had endured in the years leading up to that moment. All the memories that now crowded my mind, demanding to be faced. I had given so much of myself to him, not just in the easy ways, the smiles, the shared dinners, the nights wrapped together in bed, but in the hidden sacrifices, the ones he never noticed and never thanked me for. I had rearranged pieces of my life to fit his schedule, molded my ambitions around his, quieted my doubts when his excuses piled higher than his promises. And as I stood alone outside, the sharp air biting at my skin, I realized I had been carrying the entire weight of our so-called love, while he carried nothing at all. There were nights when I stayed up waiting for him, convincing myself that his late hours were noble, that he was working hard for us, for the future he often spoke about in broad, comforting strokes. I remembered the way he used to say "we" when he described the house we would buy, the trips we would take, the life we would build, and how that "we" slowly dissolved into "I," until it was only me keeping the vision alive. I gave him not just my time, but pieces of myself I should have guarded more carefully. My trust, my patience, my loyalty, they were poured into him like water into a cracked vessel, disappearing without ever being returned. I thought of the birthdays I planned for him, the celebrations I built with care, the times I defended him when friends whispered suspicions I didn't want to hear. I had shielded him from judgment, carried the image of his worth on my back, all while he was slipping away into another life I was never meant to see. The cruelest part was how I convinced myself it was enough, that love was supposed to be lopsided, that patience was proof of devotion, that turning away from red flags was an act of loyalty. I had told myself that endurance was strength, but standing there outside that house, I saw it differently. Endurance had been my cage, the bars I built with my own hands, telling myself that waiting for him, forgiving him, excusing him, made me a partner worth keeping. Instead, it made me easy to take for granted, a woman who carried the weight of two while he played freely with none. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood that the betrayal in that room tonight wasn't born just in the months he spent with her. It had been building all along. In every moment he let me shoulder the relationship alone, in every silence where he should have spoken, in every absence where he should have shown up. I thought back to the small details that seemed trivial at the time, but now felt like evidence carved into stone. The way he never asked about my day unless it somehow affected his. The way he let my achievements slip by without celebration. The way he dismissed my fears with a quick kiss or a careless promise he never kept. I had carried all of it alone, convincing myself it was temporary, that the man I fell for would return once the stress passed, once the job settled, once the timing was right. But now, seeing the truth laid bare, I realized the man I had been waiting for didn't exist anymore. Perhaps he never had. Perhaps all along I had been in love with the idea of him, while the real man was slowly revealing himself piece by piece, until tonight, when he finally dropped the mask completely. The weight of those years pressed harder as I walked down the street, heels clicking against the pavement, the city lights blurring through the sting of unshed tears. Not tears of weakness, but of release, as though my body was finally purging itself of the poison I had swallowed for so long. I thought of the friends I had distanced myself from because he didn't like them, the hobbies I abandoned because they didn't fit into his schedule, the dreams I postponed because they threatened to outshine his. Each memory was a stone I had carried, and each step I took that night felt like setting them down, one by one, refusing to bear their weight anymore. The truth was clear now. I had built my life around him as though he were a foundation, when in reality, he was quicksand, pulling me deeper with every sacrifice, every compromise. And standing in the cold, with nothing but my own breath clouding the air, I realized I no longer wanted to carry any of it. The past I had borne alone was no longer mine to protect. It was his to answer for, his to choke on when he finally realized what he had lost. I had walked out of that party without a scene, without a word, but I carried with me the knowledge that his entire world had shifted the moment I smiled, handed back the keys, and turned away. He thought he had stripped me of dignity, Instead, he had stripped himself of the illusion that I needed him at all, and so the past became a memory, no longer a burden, but a lesson, etched deep enough to guide me forward. I carried it alone for too long, but that night, beneath the glow of indifferent streetlights, I made the quiet vow that I would never carry such weight for anyone else again. In the days that followed that night, her face stayed with me, etched into my mind as if it had been carved there by fire. She was not a stranger who had slipped into my world unnoticed. She was someone familiar, someone who had lingered at the edges of my life, with just enough presence to appear harmless. That was what made the betrayal so much deeper. If she had been distant, some faceless woman from another city, or some nameless shadow pulled from late-night distractions, perhaps the wound would have been simpler. But no, she was closer than that. Close enough to know my existence. Close enough to smile at me once or twice with a warmth that now felt like mockery. She had been there, within reach, while weaving herself into his orbit, pretending she was nothing more than another name in the crowd, when in truth, she had been waiting for the moment to step into the light he was all too eager to give her. Her profile was not hard to piece together once I allowed myself to look back without the blinders of trust. I remembered the subtle exchanges, the way his phone would light up with her name disguised beneath an innocuous label, the way he spoke of her with casual dismissal that felt too deliberate, too practiced. I remembered the laughter I caught between them once at a gathering, the kind of laughter that carries familiarity, that secret understanding that outsiders cannot decipher. I had silenced my instincts, convinced myself I was being paranoid, clinging to loyalty while they built their deception in plain sight. And now, with clarity as sharp as glass, I could see her role for what it was. She was not simply his distraction. She was his mirror, reflecting the parts of himself he wanted to believe were irresistible, powerful, enviable. What struck me most was how unremarkable she seemed at first glance. There was no extraordinary beauty, no brilliance that would have justified the risk of tearing down everything we had. She was ordinary in ways that almost angered me, because her presence in his life was not about what she offered, but about what he could project onto her. She was a canvas, willing to play the part of the special guest, basking in the stolen glow of someone else's life, someone else's place. That ordinariness was her weapon. It made her invisible long enough to worm her way in, long enough for me to overlook her while I was busy carrying the weight of us alone. And in the quiet of my own thoughts, I realized that their bond was built not on love, but on conspiracy, the thrill of secrecy, the intoxication of betrayal. They were partners not in passion, but in deception. And yet, I found myself strangely grateful to her, because in stepping into the light so boldly, she had done for me what I had not been able to do for myself. She exposed him. She tore away the last veil of illusion I had clung to, forcing me to see him not as the man I wanted him to be, but as the man he truly was. Without her, I might have carried on, still convincing myself that loyalty required blindness, that love meant endurance. With her smirk, her presence, her audacity to stand at his side as if she belonged there, she made my decision for me. She became the embodiment of every lie he had told, every absence he had explained away, every promise he had broken. And in that embodiment, she gave me the gift of clarity. Still, that didn't erase the sting. It burned to remember the nights he had been late, the moments he had been distant, and to know now exactly where he had been, exactly whose company he had chosen over mine, the dinners he skipped, the excuses he spun. They all had her fingerprints on them. I could trace her shadow through my memories, like a stain that had always been there, waiting for me to notice. And yet, as painful as that realization was, it also freed me. Because once I saw her clearly, once I pieced together the profile of the so-called special guest, I understood that she had never been my rival. She was simply the final thread in the tapestry of his lies, the last piece that revealed the whole ugly picture. I carried that knowledge like a weapon, tucking it into the quiet corners of my mind as I began to plan what came next. They thought they had won, that their secret had been unveiled on their terms, in their space, with their control. But they had underestimated me, underestimated the way silence can sharpen into strategy. I did not need to scream, did not need to confront her or claw for scraps of dignity in front of them both. No, the most powerful revenge is the kind that unfolds slowly, meticulously, leaving them to unravel while I stand untouched. And knowing who she was, knowing what role she had played, gave me all the pieces I needed to begin. So I let her smirk linger in my mind, not as a torment, but as fuel. She had been the special guest for one night, but I would make sure she understood what it felt like when the invitation ended, when the lights dimmed, when the reality of who he was crashed down on her. Because men who betray do not change their nature, they simply change their audience. And she, standing so proudly beside him, had yet to learn that truth. But she would. They both would. The days after the party moved strangely, not in the chaos of grief, but in a calmness that seemed almost foreign, as though some deeper part of me had been waiting for this clarity all along. He thought he had humiliated me, thought I would retreat into tears, into apologies, into a desperate need to reclaim the scraps of what we once called love. Instead, I found myself moving with deliberate quiet, each choice stripped of hesitation, each thought sharper than it had ever been. I did not confront him. I did not rush to call or demand explanations, because explanations from him were worthless now. His words had already betrayed themselves. Instead, I decided in silence and certainty that my story with him would not end in the weakness he expected, but in the strength he never imagined I possessed. It began with the smallest of acts, subtle shifts in the way I carried myself. I stopped answering his calls, letting them pile one after the other, the screen of my phone lighting up with his name until it looked almost ridiculous. I knew his rhythm too well to mistake it for genuine remorse. The first calls were probably defiant, ready to chastise me for walking out. Then they grew curious, maybe even concerned. Eventually they turned frantic, but none of them mattered, because I had already made the choice. I would not give him the performance he sought. My silence was louder than any words, and in that silence, I was no longer his. The decision was not merely to leave, but to take back more than what I had handed him. For years, I had entrusted him with pieces of myself, with access to parts of my life that he had never deserved. I had given him keys, literal and metaphorical, to spaces he had no right to enter. Now, I resolved to reclaim them all. It was not about revenge in its shallow sense, not about petty gestures or dramatic scenes. It was about strategy, about ensuring that when he finally understood what he had lost, it would not be just me walking away. It would be the life he had built on my loyalty crumbling beneath his feet. I thought of the documents I still had access to, the accounts we had once shared, the conversations I had quietly archived when I began to notice the first cracks in his facade. I thought of the friends who had whispered suspicions, allies I had pushed aside in my blind defense of him, who now would not hesitate to remind the world what kind of man he truly was. I realized that I held more power than he imagined, because he had underestimated me. He believed my devotion had made me blind, when in truth, it had made me observant. I had seen more than I ever let on, and now those observations became tools. Each night I lay in bed, replaying the scene of that party, not with pain, but with precision. I remembered the smugness in his voice when he called her the special guest, the laughter that followed, the way he believed the moment belonged to him. And each time I remembered, I stripped away another thread of the bond I had once cherished. What remained was not heartbreak. It was resolve. I did not need to scream at him or at her. I did not need to stand in that room and demand acknowledgement. All I needed was to move quietly, intentionally, collecting the pieces of my life and preparing to return them to myself in full. The decision lived in the way I walked into my own home, noticing the spaces he had occupied, and reclaiming them one by one. His jacket left on the chair no longer smelled like comfort, but like intrusion. His photographs, once filled with shared smiles, now looked staged, hollow. I began to gather these remnants, not in rage, but in order, preparing for the moment when they would no longer contaminate my world. I was not erasing him. He had erased himself the moment he crowned her as something special. I was simply taking back what had always been mine, what I had carried for him while he carried nothing for me. There is a strength in deciding without announcement, a strength in knowing the power of stillness. He had made his betrayal public, loud, humiliating. My decision was the opposite: private, deliberate, and far more destructive, because the louder one screams, the quicker the sound fades. But silence, real silence, lingers. It unsettles, it festers, it forces the other person to confront themselves. And so, while he waited for the outburst that never came, while he imagined me shattered and begging, I was already building the next steps. I was already preparing for the moment when he would realize that what I had taken from him was more valuable than anything he could offer her. I knew that night at the party had been the turning point. But here, in the quiet of my own mind, was where the true shift occurred. I had stopped being his partner, stopped being his shield, stopped being the woman who carried the weight of two. I was becoming something else entirely: calculated, unshaken, and untouchable. The silent decision I had made was not just to walk away, but to ensure that when he finally understood the cost of his arrogance, there would be nothing left for him to salvage. It didn't happen overnight, though I had imagined it 1,000 times in the quiet hours after the party, when his calls still filled my phone like a relentless tide, when the echo of her smirk still lingered in my mind like a stain. The idea of silence had been my weapon, but silence alone would not be enough. I wanted him to feel what I had felt that night, not in private, not hidden behind doors where excuses could be whispered and lies patched together, but out in the open, with witnesses, with eyes that would never let him forget. If he had chosen to humiliate me in front of others, then the balance of justice demanded that his own unraveling happen in the same arena. I would give him his own spectacle, not with rage or tears, but with undeniable truth laid bare so that even he could not twist the narrative to his advantage. The opportunity came almost too perfectly, as if fate had been listening to my vow. Another gathering, another evening where he would parade himself, basking in admiration he did not deserve. This time it was a celebration hosted not at his home, but in a larger space, filled with colleagues, acquaintances, even family members. He wanted the world to see him thriving, standing tall beside his so-called special guest, as though what he had done to me had left no trace, no shadow. He thought he had rewritten the story already, that I was gone, forgotten, erased. But what he didn't know was that I had been writing a different story entirely, one where every message he sent her, every secret rendezvous, every receipt tucked carelessly into his pocket, became a page in the book of his own undoing. I had gathered it all quietly, methodically. Screenshots, photographs, bank records, whispers from those who had seen more than they let on. I did not need to embellish or dramatize. The truth was potent enough on its own. The brilliance of betrayal is that it is rarely tidy. It leaves traces, crumbs leading to the feast of arrogance at its center. He had left so many behind, thinking I was too naive to notice. But I had noticed. I had archived. And now I carried those fragments like jewels, ready to scatter them in the one place where he thought he was invincible, among his admirers. I remember walking into that room, dressed not for him but for myself, wearing a kind of strength that no fabric could mimic. Heads turned, whispers traveled quickly, because my presence was unexpected. Some thought I had come to beg, to fight, to throw myself back into the spectacle he had created. But those who looked closer, who saw the calmness in my step and the steadiness of my gaze, sensed that this was something else. I wasn't there to reclaim him. I was there to end him. The moment arrived when he, in his usual arrogance, took the center of the room, lifting his glass, her arm entwined in his, as though they were royalty among subjects. He started his speech, words dripping with the same practiced charm that once fooled me, thanking those gathered, celebrating his achievements, gesturing to her as though she were his crown. And that was when I stepped forward. Not loudly, not theatrically, but with a poise that cut through the noise more effectively than any shout could have. The crowd stilled, their attention shifting like a tide. His eyes widened when he saw me, the confident rhythm of his words faltering for just a moment, the first crack appearing in the mask he wore so easily. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need anger. I simply unfolded the truth, one piece at a time, each revelation falling into the room like shards of glass. The messages, projected onto the screen behind me with the help of an ally who had been waiting for my signal, displayed his promises to her, his insults about me, his detailed lies that overlapped with nights he claimed to be working late. The receipts followed, bank statements highlighting dinners, trips, gifts purchased in secret, and then the photographs, undeniable in their intimacy, painting the portrait of a man who had built his world on deception. Gasps spread through the crowd, the kind of sound that fills a room when illusions are shattered. His colleagues exchanged glances, his family stiffened, and she, the so-called special guest, shifted uncomfortably, her smirk evaporating into panic. He tried to speak, of course, tried to explain, to dismiss, to turn the tide back in his favor. But every word he reached for was drowned out by the evidence, by the weight of the witnesses around him who could no longer pretend not to see. His arrogance had thrived in secrecy, in the quiet corners where lies could survive. In the light, in front of everyone he had hoped to impress, it withered. The man who had introduced his mistress with pride now stood stripped, not just of dignity, but of credibility, his empire of deceit collapsing in real time. And through it all I smiled, not cruelly, not with vindictive glee, but with the calm assurance of someone who had reclaimed her power. Because this wasn't just about revenge, it was about balance, about ensuring that the humiliation he had orchestrated for me would return to him tenfold. He had wanted a spectacle, and I had given him one, though not the kind he had imagined. This was not the triumph of a man flaunting a new conquest. This was the public dissection of his lies, the moment when everyone who mattered saw him not as a victor, but as a fraud. When it was over, I didn't linger. I didn't need to. The room buzzed with whispers, his name now tainted, her presence now awkward, their future already fractured under the weight of what I had revealed. I walked away with the same quiet grace I had left his first party, leaving behind not chaos, but clarity. And as I stepped into the night once more, I knew the spectacle would echo long after I was gone, each retelling of the story, a nail in the coffin of the life he had tried to build on betrayal. The aftermath of that night unfolded with the inevitability of a storm, once the clouds have already gathered, the implosion beginning not with shouts but with silence, the kind that drips into every corner of a room and makes breathing feel heavier. I hadn't needed to stay to watch it happen. The cracks I had opened were enough to ensure that the collapse would come without my presence. Yet, through the whispers that traveled back to me, through the friends who relayed the chaos with wide eyes and hushed tones, I could reconstruct the way their carefully constructed facade crumbled under its own weight. It was almost poetic. Two people who had once reveled in secrecy, suddenly forced to stand under a spotlight so blinding that every flaw, every betrayal, every fracture in their alliance became impossible to ignore. She, the so-called special guest, had been smug in her position, clinging to the illusion that his devotion was hers alone, that by humiliating me, he had elevated her. But arrogance is a fragile crown, and hers shattered the moment she realized the evidence I revealed didn't just indict him, but also her. The whispers in the crowd weren't only about his deceit, they were about hers. Her willingness to participate, to smile in my face while entwined with him behind closed doors. People she had hoped to charm now avoided her eyes, their admiration curdling into contempt. She hadn't stolen a man. She had inherited a scandal, and even she wasn't prepared to carry that weight. For him, the implosion was even uglier. The same voice that had confidently declared her as his special guest now stumbled over excuses, contradictions spilling from his mouth faster than he could contain them. His arrogance had never been built for scrutiny, only for admiration. And when that admiration turned to disgust, when colleagues whispered about lost contracts and family members muttered about shame, his composure unraveled. He tried to cling to her, the woman he had flaunted as a prize, but even she recoiled when the room became hostile. She hadn't expected to be humiliated by association, hadn't expected his downfall to drag her down with him. Their alliance, once strengthened by the thrill of secrecy, began to corrode in public view, each of them desperate to save themselves, each blaming the other for the ruin now consuming them. What I heard later almost made me laugh, not out of joy, but out of the strange satisfaction that comes when justice delivers itself. They fought openly, their whispers sharp enough for others to overhear, their blame echoing through the corridors after the guests began to leave. He accused her of pushing him into risks, of demanding more than he could hide. She accused him of weakness, of not protecting her from exposure, of failing to control the narrative. They had once been partners in deceit, but now, stripped of their secrecy, they were simply two liars grasping at air, turning on each other with the same ruthlessness they had once reserved for me. The implosion didn't stop at arguments. It seeped into their lives like a poison, spreading into spaces they couldn't contain. Colleagues withdrew, unwilling to be tied to his scandal. Friends, the kind who had once laughed alongside them, stopped answering calls. Even family, the blood ties he thought unbreakable, pulled away with cold remarks about disappointment and shame. And as their social world disintegrated, so too did the illusion of their romance. Without admiration, without secrecy, without the thrill of betrayal, they were left only with each other, and what remained between them was nothing but resentment. I imagined him in his apartment, once so full of self-assurance, now echoing with the emptiness of unanswered calls and unopened invitations. I imagined her beside him, restless, bitter, realizing that she hadn't ascended into some grand role, but had merely become a footnote in his downfall. They must have looked at each other and seen not partners, not lovers, but the embodiment of every choice that had led them to ruin. Betrayal is a currency that spends quickly, and theirs had bought them only destruction. And in the quiet of my own space, I found peace in knowing that their implosion required nothing more from me. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't begged, hadn't stooped to their level. I had simply revealed the truth, and the truth had done what it always does when given enough light. It destroyed the lies that depended on darkness to survive. They had imploded not because of me, but because of themselves, because deceit is never sustainable, because arrogance always forgets how fragile it really is. What remained for me was not bitterness, but a calm, steady satisfaction. I didn't need to witness their downfall firsthand. It was enough to know that the spectacle of their implosion was etched into the memory of everyone who had once admired them. They had tried to write me out of the story, but instead I had become its author, and they its cautionary tale. And as they clawed at each other in the ruins of their alliance, I was already free, already gone, already walking toward a life that no longer carried the weight of their deceit. For all the satisfaction that came with watching their alliance collapse, I knew it wasn't enough to leave things in the hands of whispers and reputations alone. Shame was a wound, but wounds could heal, and I wasn't content to let him limp away with only a bruised ego and her resentment. No, the betrayal I endured had stretched too far and too deep to be paid back in gossip. I wanted him to lose in the way I had lost, not only emotionally but tangibly, in the spaces that mattered most, in the places where consequences could not be ignored or spun into another lie. And so I began to move quietly, not with cruelty but with precision, ensuring that the final blow would be one he could not escape, a loss he would feel in his home, his career, his standing, his pocket, his future. I had always been careful, perhaps more careful than he had ever realized. While he believed me blind in devotion, I had learned long ago to keep records, to hold on to documents, to save threads of conversations that made my skin crawl, even when I couldn't yet name why. All of those fragments, stored neatly away, became the foundation of my retaliation. I did not shout. I did not confront, but I compiled. I built a narrative so airtight that no charm could undo it, no denial could withstand it. I reached out to allies, the colleagues who had once trusted him but now questioned him, the contacts who owed me favors, the people who had whispered truths behind closed doors and were now ready to speak. Piece by piece, I gathered the materials that would make his downfall official, irreversible. The first strike landed in his career, the one place where he had always drawn the most pride. He had cultivated an image of reliability, of professionalism, the kind of man who could be trusted with responsibility. But what his employers saw now, through carefully delivered evidence, was a man reckless with money, dishonest with his time, blending personal betrayals into professional deceit. The receipts that revealed dinners and trips he disguised as work obligations were enough to raise eyebrows, enough to plant suspicion. Suspicion became investigation, and investigation quickly became dismissal. His position, the one he flaunted to impress her and belittle me, was stripped away. The emails that reached him were no longer filled with praise or invitations. They were termination notices, accounts closed, doors locked. The second strike came socially. Families and friends, who might have forgiven whispers of infidelity as private sins, could not ignore proof of his deceit sprawled across group chats and forwarded emails. His arrogance had thrived on admiration, on the illusion of respectability, but admiration curdles quickly when truth poisons it. Invitations dried up. Friends who had once laughed at his side avoided him in public. Even gatherings he tried to attend ended in awkward silences, in side glances that reminded him of the evidence everyone had seen. He had humiliated me by introducing her as his special guest, but now the title followed him like a curse. He wasn't a man admired for his boldness. He was a man whispered about as a fool, a fraud, a warning. And then came the most personal loss, the one that cut deepest. When I left, I had not just walked away with my dignity. I had taken back control of the things he assumed he would always have access to. The joint accounts I once managed, the assets tied to my name, the passwords he had relied on me to remember. I severed them all. He had built his life leaning on me in ways he never acknowledged. And now, stripped of my support, he discovered how flimsy his independence really was. The credit cards declined. The rent payments stalled. The comforts he took for granted slipped from his fingers one by one. I didn't need to touch his possessions or stand in his doorway shouting for what was mine. I had already taken it all back before he realized it was missing. And when he reached for it, when he tried to use it, he discovered only absence. That was the kind of loss he couldn't charm away, couldn't deny to himself even in solitude. What satisfied me most wasn't his begging, though it came, relentless, through calls, messages, even letters slipped under my door. What satisfied me was knowing that every plea was driven not by love or regret, but by desperation, by the fear of a man who finally realized he had destroyed the only foundation that had ever held him upright. He had thought himself untouchable, but I had touched every corner of his life without laying a finger on him, dismantling the empire of lies he had built until nothing remained but rubble. The final blow wasn't a single act. It was the accumulation of losses he could not escape, the stripping away of everything he had relied on until all that remained was the hollow shell of his arrogance. And when I thought of him now, pacing in an empty apartment, reputation ruined, bank accounts dry, his mistress long gone, I felt no pity, only peace, because he had taught me, through his betrayal, how to take back what was mine and more. And now, he lived in the ruins, while I walked away unburdened. There comes a moment, after the chaos subsides and the noise of betrayal fades, when silence takes on a different meaning. It is no longer the silence of shock or the silence of strategy, but the silence of renewal, the soundless space in which one begins again. For me, that silence arrived slowly, like dawn seeping through the cracks of a long, dark night. The wreckage of what he had done no longer weighed on me. I had carried it long enough, dragged it through rooms where I did not belong, let it carve itself into my skin until I believed it defined me. But standing now in my own space, untouched by his presence, I realized I was not scarred. I was sharpened. The woman who had walked into his party that night was gone. In her place stood someone entirely different, someone who had been tempered by fire and come out gleaming. Freedom revealed itself in the simplest ways, waking in the morning without the dread of checking my phone for excuses or half-truths, sitting at a cafe alone, savoring coffee not as a filler between obligations, but as a pleasure of my own choosing, reconnecting with friends I had once pushed away, realizing how easily they welcomed me back, how their laughter filled the spaces he had hollowed out. I rediscovered parts of myself I had abandoned, the hobbies I had shelved, the dreams I had postponed, the ambitions I had quieted so as not to overshadow him. It was like stepping back into a room I had forgotten was mine, dusting off the furniture, throwing open the windows, letting light in again. At first I thought healing would come with triumph, with the satisfaction of knowing he was ruined. But I discovered that true healing wasn't about him at all. His losses were his own, the consequences of his arrogance, and they no longer concerned me. What mattered was that I had reclaimed my own life, not as a reaction to him, but as a declaration for myself. For so long, I had defined my worth through his approval, his presence, his promises. Now I understood that my worth had never lived there. It had always been mine, waiting for me to stop giving it away so cheaply. I learned to enjoy solitude, not as emptiness, but as fullness, the kind that comes when you realize you no longer need to be seen through anyone else's eyes to exist. Nights once spent waiting for him became nights spent writing, reading, walking under city lights with no destination. I found joy in my own company, in the rhythm of my steps, in the strength of my independence. And slowly, the bitterness melted away, leaving only clarity. He had betrayed me, yes, but in doing so he had also liberated me. He had shown me exactly where I never wanted to be again, exactly who I would never shrink for again, exactly how much stronger I was when I stood alone than when I bent to hold someone else upright. The people who had witnessed my silence that night at the party, the ones who had expected my collapse, began to speak of me differently. They remembered the calmness of my smile, the poise of my departure, the strength of my revelations. And though I did not seek their admiration, it found me anyway. My story traveled, retold in fragments, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes understated, but always carrying the same truth. I had not broken. I had not begged. I had walked away with more than I had lost. And in a world that too often delights in watching women crumble, my refusal to collapse became its own form of power. As for him, he became a ghost in my life, occasionally surfacing in whispers, in stories of his decline, in the way people spoke his name with pity instead of respect. But even those whispers grew faint over time, until he was little more than a memory, a shadow cast behind me as I moved forward. I did not hate him anymore. Hate is still a tether, and I had cut every tie. He had become irrelevant, and that was a punishment far greater than my vengeance could ever have designed. To be forgotten, to be erased from the life of the woman who once carried you, there is no wound more final than that. Rebirth isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or applause. It comes quietly, in the steady rhythm of a heart that finally beats without fear, in the confidence of steps taken without hesitation, in the softness of nights where sleep arrives without tears. I was not reborn into someone unrecognizable. I was simply returned to myself, the self I had neglected, the self I had silenced. And standing in that truth, I realized the betrayal had not ended me. It had begun me again. So the story closes not with a plea, not with regret, but with freedom. I am no longer the woman who stood in that room and heard him call her the special guest. I am the woman who walked out, who took back her keys, who reclaimed more than he ever thought I would, who left him to drown in his own lies while I learned to swim in the clear waters of my own independence. And if there is one thing I carry now, it is this. Betrayal may break the illusions we build, but it also breaks the chains we tie ourselves with. And when those chains fall, the only thing left is strength.